Story 1. Maybe it's just me, but on still, clear nights, the stars are above you in the sky, then they are reflected beneath you in the water. You lose the horizon and feel like you are floating in space. You can lose yourself in that place. Story 2. So it is actually quite common to see ghost vessels. Boats that are undamaged but have no souls on board in the middle of the sea. The reason for these is usually quite simple. They are often private boats that have encountered bad weather, snapped their lines, and drifted away. It still feels creepy when one passes by in the middle of the night, hundreds of miles from land. Story 3. Not necessarily at sea, but I worked on a research ship in the Arctic. We were slowly pushing our way through an ice fog. A friend and I were on deck having a smoke, just watching the ice slowly float by, when a large seal lying on the ice came into view. It was obviously dead, as the skin had fallen away from its ribs, but otherwise it was perfectly preserved. Just as the seal started to disappear in the fog, a polar bear appeared, crouched as though it was stalking the seal. It was also dead. The fur on its extended front leg had fallen away, exposing the bone. Otherwise, it was also perfectly preserved. Almost in unison, my friend and I looked at each other and said, "What the heck?" Story 4. On a drill ship off the coast of Nigeria, one evening the entire surface of the ocean was covered with jellyfish as far as the eye could see. An hour or two later, they were all gone. Story 5. Down in the Caribbean, there was a 90-foot commercial fishing vessel sitting on top of a 100-foot cliff where it had been tossed like a toy during a hurricane. Hurricanes are very powerful. Story 6. The only time I was ever on a ship was actually a cargo ship, and it was for a program in my business class. Basically, you got to shadow several people and see a product's full journey. I started at a farm, went to a trucking depot, then a dry goods warehouse, then a cargo yard, and finally a cargo ship to China. You can't get off the ship when it gets there, so that was the end. Then I caught a ride back on another cargo ship. The trip was very informative. The creepy thing, though, was at 6 a.m. when the ship blew its horn. We were out somewhere in the Pacific and then slowed down over the next 20 minutes. I made my way up to the guy who was running the program, and he's talking to the captain. The captain was clearly pretty freaked out. This was the absolute middle of nowhere, and there was a tiny coral island with no trees or vegetation, just a large number of birds and a cargo container next to a tent. The ship was hardly moving at this point, and the captain called out over a megaphone to see if anyone was there. After a minute, a clean-shaven man wearing clothes worn to rags and with a deep tan wobbled out of the cargo container. The captain yelled out to ask if the man needed help. He said something, but they couldn't hear it. A volunteer went out to him on an inflatable boat. He climbed down the rope and got on the boat. Meanwhile, the man was just sitting on a bucket. The volunteer got within 20 feet of the man. They talked for a few minutes, and then the volunteer came back. He climbed the ladder and went to the captain. The captain asked what the man had said. The volunteer said, "He said he's good." The man gave no information, no plans, had no food except dried fish and some water distilling equipment, was hundreds of miles from another living person, had no boat, and said, "I'm good." Story 7. 1. Unbeknownst to anyone on board, the mafia welded a box full of narcotics onto the vessel's hull underwater in the Caribbean, only for their associates in North America to retrieve them. Similar incidents have led to underwater inspections by Coast Guard divers on vessel arrivals from specific ports. A crew member called the bridge frantically to inform me that the sofa in the smoke room was possessed by a spirit. On closer inspection, a stowaway had lifted the cushions in a Dracula-like manner, trying to emerge during the night once we were underway in international waters. A wire rope snapped during mooring operations, severely injuring a crew member whom we had to collect in bags. Traumatic to say the least. Such experiences never leave you. A crew member repeatedly removed the safety guard from a grinding disc for convenience, causing the disc to crack and send shrapnel into his left eye. He screamed in agony for days until we reached the nearest helicopter rescue area in the Pacific. On the Orinoco River in the Venezuelan Amazon, we interacted with indigenous tribes, exchanging shoes, basic medicines, mosquito repellent, and detergent for wild honey, fish, and unfamiliar wild fruit. Story 8. You would expect otherwise, but I have seen more people drown than I would consider reasonable. It is always the same cycle. People become overconfident and do not bother wearing personal protective equipment. Then one day, someone slips and falls into the water. Survival depends on the weather. The port reacts like a beehive. Suddenly, everyone is highly aware of personal protective equipment, but 1 month later, everyone has forgotten, and no one wants to bother with the tedious process of properly fitting a life jacket until someone falls again later and the cycle repeats. Story 9. I spent a summer on a fish processing vessel about 2/3 of the way out on the Aleutian Island chain in Alaska, most of the way to Russia. We were buying fish from a large tender, and some of the older hands on my processor boat were grumbling. I asked why, and they told me a story. Turns out the year before, there had been a fire on the boat I was serving on, and this fire occurred while they were tied up to the same tender we were buying fish from right then. When the guys on the tender saw smoke coming from our boat, they took axes and cut the lines instead of getting our crew onto their boat. A fire at sea is one of the worst things imaginable. Those men cut our boat loose without rescuing any of the crew. A year later, my bosses were still doing business with them. If I were in charge, I would have told them to go away. Nobody on my processor boat was hurt, but it could have gone the other way very easily. The guys on the tender would have just watched it happen. They probably would have called the United States Coast Guard, but otherwise, best of luck. It speaks to the intense greed of the commercial fishing industry. Story 10. Does fishing count as working? My dad and I were fishing and thought we saw a sea turtle with its head sticking out of the water. My dad told me to get our camera out back in the 90s, and I was ready to take the shot. As we got in range, we realized it was a body floating belly up, arms straight up in the air. The man had been fishing a few days before with friends when a storm blew in and capsized his boat in the Long Island Sound. The anchor was off the back next to the engine, with waves hitting the front, which flipped the boat. He did not get his life jacket on in time. His 3 friends made it to shore, but he did not. We drove back to the marina, as the radio was not working that day, and reported it. A few other boats had also reported, and they were in the process of recovering the body. Story 11. I was traveling through Bab el-Mandeb. The sun had set about an hour before when, suddenly, we picked up 4 speedboats pacing us on radar with no running lights. There was no moon, so it was dark. We topped out at 20 knots. They sped toward us at around 35 to 45 knots and came within 6 nautical miles before leaving us alone. The atmosphere on board completely changed. The captain was called to the bridge, and we were preparing to report the situation when they turned away. I was aboard the Maersk Carolina, which is a sister ship to the Maersk Alabama and on the same route. The Maersk Alabama was hijacked a year or 2 later. We had no armed security on board. Story 12. We used to have to measure the fuel tanks on the United States Coast Guard cutter I was on. That involved going out to the decks and inserting a tape measure into the tanks. If we did it at night with a flashlight, sometimes a flying fish, which is attracted to light, would jump out and hit us in the face. That was jarring. Story 13. Rogue waves freak me out quite a bit. I never got to see them because I worked in engineering, but I remember we got hit by one beam 2 at around 3 a.m. It almost threw me out of my rack, knocked a bunch of things off that were not strapped down, almost broke our TV, and then it went right back to being pretty calm outside. Everyone in my room woke up. Nobody got hurt, but we all just stared at each other like, what just happened? Story 14. Not me, but a colleague I worked with was dive harvesting in an area where a boat had recently gone down. People were lost. As he moved along the bottom, he saw ahead what looked like the shape of a man in oil-slick rain gear. Reluctantly, he moved forward. As he got closer, he saw the bib pants, boots, and jacket laid out on the ocean floor as if a man had just been lying there. Preparing himself for the worst, he came within touching distance and found they were empty. Story 15. Not a worker, but when I was younger, my family took a trip to the Florida Gulf. A couple of cousins and I went deep-sea fishing about 20 to 30 miles off the coast. I got horrendously seasick and was bedridden the whole time, taking a nap. When I finally woke up, a storm had started to roll in. I remember looking out at the back of the boat and seeing the sky turning an ominous dark gray, and the water just turned black. The waves were starting to get pretty intense, and the captain said, "All right, we really need to get back before this gets to a point where we cannot." I never liked open water, and that experience just made it worse. Story 16. Prior Navy here. I saw a few intense things during that time, but this was afterward while doing a security job. Navy experiences mostly involve injuries and similar incidents. I'll start by saying I'm not superstitious, not religious, and don't believe aliens are on Earth. I am a game designer and an engineering master's degree student. I believe in what can be proven through science, but I acknowledge that science hasn't explained everything yet. I have no worldly explanation for this story. The post was essentially a fire watch. Stay up all night, perform rounds to ensure the ship doesn't sink or catch fire. The ship was in port for a major overhaul. They had completely ripped out the wiring and the old public address system for modernization. The old one had typical megaphone-style loudspeakers mounted to bulkheads throughout the ship. The loudspeakers were still attached to the walls, but the wiring was cut, and the system itself was completely gone. Around 3 a.m. one night, I heard the all-hands whistle, like a typical bosun's whistle, followed by some mumbling, as if someone was trying to speak through the speakers. I was confused because I could clearly see the cut wires, and I knew I was alone on the ship. I assumed it was possibly interference in the magnetic speakers picking up radio waves or something similar. During my next rounds, I discovered a shipyard worker had left a soldering iron on, which had practically melted a hole in the deck. There was no fire, but a bright red spot and some smoke. I reported it, and it was handled by the shipyard damage control team. In the morning, when the crew arrived, I discussed the incident with a member of the crew assigned as the officer of the deck for the day. When he asked if anything else had happened overnight, I casually mentioned the strange experience with the loudspeaker as a joke. He responded deadpan that it was the former executive officer of the ship who had apparently dropped dead at the intercom station. He said they had experienced it a few times before, and it always preceded some incident that could have injured a crew member or endangered the ship. I wasn't sure if he was joking or if this was typical sailor superstition I had heard before. I was polite and acted surprised. A few shifts later, I heard the whistle and weird crackling again. Out of paranoia, I started my next rounds early. Sure enough, the seawater coolant system in the engine room was leaking into the compartment. It was not a large leak, but if left unchecked, it could have caused serious damage. About a year later, I ran into that same officer, and he told me the captain had requested the old loudspeakers remain while disconnected. He said he had left the crew shortly after those incidents and was unaware of any new cases. I've never had anything like this happen before or since, but I still think about it. I keep telling myself there's a logical explanation and it's just a coincidence, but I can't shake the eerie feeling from it all. Story 17. I was on a large ferry in the middle of a cyclone. Waves were washing over the third deck. All crew and passengers wore life jackets just in case, although it might not have helped if we had to abandon ship. Waves broke some windows, and the lower decks got soaked. Apart from a few scrapes, bruises, and stains, we made it to port. Story 18. We had crocodiles and sharks circling our boat at the same time while we were processing the fish and throwing the guts overboard. That was not necessarily creepy, but was definitely exhilarating. The captain said he had seen the crocodiles wait between the dinghy and the main boat to snap at you when you hop onto the dinghy. Tropical seas are a whole different challenge. Everything in that water is dangerous in some way. Edit. This occurred in northern Australian coastal waters since several people asked. Story 19. This wasn't even out at sea. It was in a small coastal town about 30 miles north of Boston. There's a point off the main beach of this town that features a curved line of rocks extending into the ocean. It's a quarter-moon crescent-shaped formation that doesn't extend into the water more than 25 to 30 feet at most. However, there's an underwater cliff, and the depth of the water at the furthest point out is deep enough that you can't reach the bottom without specialized scuba gear, as regular scuba diving equipment isn't enough. Keep in mind, if it isn't low tide, you can't get to this point without getting your feet and legs wet, about up to your knees. A handful of us were on the furthest point, a popular spot for locals to saltwater fish. I was just watching the fisherman and enjoying the experience when I heard a fisherman give a soft but defeated, "Oh." It's difficult to describe because "oh" isn't typically associated with a terrified reaction, but you could hear the overwhelming distress in his voice, like it was quiet because he couldn't catch his breath well enough to say more or louder. I turned to look, and there was a sea creature bigger than a bus, with fierce Jurassic Park-esque spots so close together they looked like stripes at first glance. This creature was about 3 feet from the rock, riding right on top of the water. The most terrifying part was its mouth. It was big enough to swallow a sedan whole, and its teeth didn't even seem real. They were like science fiction horror uni teeth, with the top and bottom connected along the sides of its gargantuan mouth. I fully understood the first fisherman's inability to say more than a delicate "oh," as this didn't look like anything I had ever heard of before. This was a monster from outer space, but this wasn't a movie. It was right there in the water in front of me. I half expected someone to pop out of the back of the creature and scream, "April Fool," as it didn't seem possible such a creature really existed. It turned out to be a basking shark, giant and fierce-looking but a plankton-eating gentle giant. I had heard the name before but never seen a picture of a basking shark, and I guess most of the others there hadn't either. For a few moments, we all stood there terrified, wondering what in the name of Alien versus Predator was going to happen to us. Finally, one of the older fishermen on the rock informed us what it was and assured us we were in no danger. I believed him but was still trembling for the rest of the night. Story 20. Heavy seas during a storm on the flight deck. When you see real waves and feel how insignificant you are in the ocean, it makes for a surreal experience. One wrong step and there is literally no rescue. Now imagine you need to be alongside the ship, pulling up heavy metal fences while the ship bounces like a springboard, up and down, side to side, all at the same time. Oil-slick tarmac glides like butter, so you better pray you have the right boots on. Not gonna lie, I had to tap out momentarily and readjust before I went out again. It was definitely an experience. It's creepy because after one liftoff, you wait around for the next flight, and you can feel the ship being thrown around, crashing reverberations through the flight hangar, and residual oil from prior pre-flight maintenance that you almost always walk into. Story 21. Did not see it, but I will never forget this comment when this question comes up again. Pumping deadheads. I could not find it, but there is another comment on one of these posts about someone in a sailboat seeing one just miss them while they were moving quickly at night. Edit. Found it. Story 22. Out of sight of land. The water suddenly became glass smooth as the sun was setting. A crew member experienced floor psychosis and fought to step off the back swim deck onto the surface of the ocean, which he was convinced was actually land. He had to be handcuffed to a bunk and given Valium by force. We turned back to the nearest port to drop him off while he screamed that the boat was not real. If he had bolted even a few seconds earlier, he would have likely died. Story 23. My cousin worked on prawn trawlers in the Gulf of Carpentaria off North Queensland for 3 years in the 1980s. It was really good money but hard work, as they would stay at sea for weeks offloading into a mothership. In the last season, they returned to port with one less crew member. The official story was that he was washed overboard in a storm. It took over 10 years before my cousin admitted the man was difficult and regularly started fights but made the mistake of pulling a knife on an experienced sailor. They tipped him overboard. The captain announced that the work would be harder, but they would receive the deceased crew member's share of the pay. Story 24. I saw the Deepwater Horizon on fire the night it happened. I guess I would not call it creepy. Sobering and awesome in the original sense are more accurate descriptions. It was just a massive structure completely covered in flames against a black backdrop. We were not allowed closer than a mile or so, if I recall correctly. I cannot imagine what that would have looked like and felt like from up close. Story 25. Out tuna fishing about 170 miles off the Oregon coast one night. We had shut down and were just about to go to bed when I noticed an odd glowing orb the size of a football down in the water. I thought it was a bioluminescent jellyfish until it started moving. It had no swimming motion, just slowly cruising around the boat. We had a 1,000,000 candle power spotlight on board, so I brought it out to see what it might be. But when I put the light on it, it fully disappeared. I turned the lights off, and there it was, plain as day. A few more showed up and moved around the boat for about 20 minutes. We never saw a trace of what they were in the light, but my crewman and I were seeing the same thing. They eventually left and we went to bed. My crewman was an experienced sailor. He had sailed from Vancouver Island to the South Pacific and back single-handed twice, worked on many tuna boats all over the Pacific, and said he had never seen anything like it. Story 26. About 75 miles off the coast of Maine on a 55-foot sailboat. There was no wind at all, just fog so thick we could barely see the bow, and it was dead silent. Suddenly, there was a disturbance in the water to the side. A giant series of bubbles. The boat listed and started sliding into the bubbles. It lasted just a few seconds but stopped as quickly as it had started. We tried convincing ourselves it was just a whale bubble fishing. It didn't really work. Story 27. My grandfather worked as a United States Navy cook and he refused to eat shrimp, crab, or any bottom feeder after working at sea. He always said that whenever something dies, they are the first to start scavenging. It made me wonder what exactly he saw being eaten by them that made him so viscerally sickened by the idea of eating any of their kind. Story 28. Fall of 2001, USS Philippine Sea. We were heading home across the Atlantic chasing a hurricane. 4 days of 15 to 20 degree pitch and 20 to 30 degree rolls. The whole ship smelled of puke. The bow would go underwater, not just a big splash, but underwater. If you went to the forward part of the ship, you could go up and down ladder wells in one step if you timed it right. Because the pitching was so great, the counter-rotating screws would make the back of the ship shake like an earthquake when they got near the surface. Story 29. My father was in the Navy in the late 1970s. His aircraft carrier was traveling through the Bermuda Triangle, heading for the Mediterranean. He was on the flight deck one night when all power on the ship suddenly died. Even people's watches stopped working. Around this time, he and other sailors noticed two lights in the distance, unmoving and about 100 feet above the water. The lights were visible for several minutes before they disappeared. My father did not see them disappear, but others said they saw the lights quickly descend into the water. In any case, after the lights disappeared, the power returned to the ship. My father does not believe in unidentified flying objects, stories about the Bermuda Triangle, or anything supernatural, although he wishes that Bigfoot were real. To this day, he has no explanation for what happened. All he knows is that during those few minutes, he experienced a strange sense of accepted dread that he has never felt before or since. There was a time when I thought he was just misleading us kids, even though he is not that kind of person. When I was a teenager, he had a small reunion with some of his old Navy friends, and they talked about the incident, even debating whether it was aliens or some kind of secret military technology being tested. Story 30. Response to the Great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. The debris fields of people's lives were washed out to sea. Roofs of houses, sheds, furniture, picture frames, overturned boats, everyday items, all adrift. More than 15,000 people were washed out to sea. Erie. Story 31. I was working on a pearl boat for around 18 months on the Arafura Sea a few years ago. One of my roles was keeping watch in the wheelhouse. Essentially, you make sure the boat is following the preset path on the navigation system. If it strays, you turn manually to keep it within the set course. My watch was from 4 to 8 a.m. Around 7 a.m., I noticed a white cube about 200 meters on the port side. It was hard to say exactly because there was no point of reference. It didn't appear on the navigation or radar system we had, which allowed us to plot and recognize boats. It was also not bobbing with the waves. It was just sitting on the waterline in the distance. I got a better look at it with binoculars. It was strange seeing this white cube just sitting still on the sea in the distance. It wasn't hovering above the water, but as the waves moved with the ocean, every now and then I could see the bottom of it, which is how I knew it was a cube. Again, without a point of reference, it is hard to say, but I estimate it was the size of a van based on how big things appear in binoculars when I know their actual size. The person following my shift came to drop me a coffee and saw it too, so I know it wasn't just me being tired. A few years later, I saw the Tic Tac videos released by the Pentagon. Some fighter pilots said they saw similarly shaped objects floating in the sky. Story 32. The total, complete, absolute darkness that is the sea on a moonless night feels like floating in a void. It is hard to describe the creepiness of not being able to distinguish between sea and sky. If you fall overboard, it is extremely difficult to find you, especially in a big swell. Except for the slapping of the water against the hull, it is totally silent. Story 33. Another one. USS McInerney off the coast of Ecuador somewhere. Our helicopter was out looking for drug boats, so we were all on the flight deck getting some sun, fishing, or generally not doing anything. Suddenly the ship's engine stopped, and everything shut down. It was a good thing the sea was smooth as glass that day. About 20 minutes later, I noticed the helicopter doing the lost communications signaling. It wasn't just the engines that died. It was everything. Story 34. Stepdad built and chartered 40-foot boats to go fishing in the shallow ocean and deep-sea fishing past the continental drop-off, where you fish mahi-mahi and king mackerel. A group booked a trip to remember a deceased friend who wanted his ashes spread in the deep sea. They left the docks. Once land disappeared, a small black cloud formed above their boat. It got bigger, darker, and louder, but it only stayed above their boat. Blue skies surrounded them, but above their boat was a very dark and angry cloud. The cloud followed them, thundering and causing equipment to malfunction. My stepdad said, "We are here. Throw this angry mother over." They spread his ashes. He said, the minute they spread his ashes, the thundering stopped, and within 5 minutes, the sky was perfectly clear. He is not one to believe in spooky stuff, but he said, "I had no explanation other than that son of a bitch was pissed off about being dead." Story 35. I watched a seal deliberately torture seagulls once. The seal had caught and killed a fish, which he used to attract seagulls. Then he grabbed a seagull and held it underwater for an extended period before releasing it. It looked like he was having fun. Story 36. I worked on a dive boat that took customers out for the weekend. Someone had to pick up the lights after the night dive. I have been alone on the seafloor 100 miles offshore in 100 feet of water with just some flashlights and a 19 cubic feet spare tank. It is creepy to hear the sounds that are not in your light cone. Also, dozens of barracuda in a school when I dove off the sundeck, dove as in diving board type dive, not self-contained underwater breathing apparatus dive. I went about 20 feet below the surface surrounded by them. We would also occasionally spearfish for lionfish under the rigs and make ceviche. I had my trap full and 2 on the spear with a nurse shark chasing me back to the boat. I missed that job. I had a regular tank as well, but no buddy, just the spare pony bottle. Story 37. You have never experienced darkness until you are out at sea. I can only explain it by saying complete blackness. Story 38. My father was in a small group of minesweepers during the Second World War, off the coast of Iceland. They were in the middle of a sweep when they passed a downed and floating German aircraft, with a pilot frantically waving to them for rescue. They had to sail right past and leave him to his fate because of the very real possibility of submarine threats. Fast forward 65 years, and my father wept on his deathbed about leaving the poor man to die in the icy Atlantic waters. Story 39. When I was in the Navy, we were just off the coast of Italy at midnight. It was a dark night, and you could not see any lights from the shore at all, no stars. At some point, we passed a long boat, basically an extended rowboat. It had no superstructure or anything, but it had a light on. The ship's captain told us that this was a person fishing, and the light would attract fish or whatever. So yes, whoever it was in a completely exposed boat about 10 or 12 miles offshore on a completely dark night. They had a light on to attract things. Story 40. I work on a deep water drilling rig. We use a remotely operated vehicle for all of our subsea work. We are commonly in 6,000 to 8,000 feet of water. The things I have seen from the subsea video are wild, like sea creatures I have never seen before in books. It is amazing to see what lives in water that deep. Story 41. I was with my grandfather fishing off the coast of Oregon. A whale surfaced under us and lifted the entire 50-foot boat out of the water. A big black eye was looking right at us. Grandpa reached over and petted it. I almost passed out. Story 42. I worked on a scallop boat and someone dredged up a half-decomposed shark. That was the day I learned that a half-decomposed shark's head looks concerningly like a human torso at first glance. The snout had rotted away to resemble a pelvis, and the way the gills were exposed looked completely like a set of ribs from a distance. It was very relieving to see that it wasn't human. But on that same trip, I heard some crewmates talking about a boat they knew that discovered a human head and was thoroughly investigated after coming to port. Story 43. 5 fires, 1 death. 3 men overboard, rescued. 2 deaths by natural causes. Cleared out the food freezer to put the bodies in until we reached port. Rescued 11 men in a lifeboat whose ship sank days earlier. Rescued for crew members of a helicopter that crashed in the water. Got caught in 2 typhoons that severely damaged our ships. Another typhoon broke all our mooring lines in port and threw our ship across the harbor, slamming it into the dock. Just missed being hit by the 2004 tsunami by a few hours. Stowaways from East Africa will hide anywhere. You can never find all the places they hide. They come out after a couple of days at sea asking for food and water, thinking they are safe with us. They don't realize our next port of call is not the United States of America, but another African nation that will arrest them and beat them in jail. Just missed being the ship that the Captain Phillips pirates took by a few miles. The Maersk Alabama was on our radar just ahead of us. I shared a stateroom with a man who killed his father with an axe at 14 years old. The captain didn't tell me until 2 days before we got back to port. There was a fire axe on the bulkhead right outside our stateroom. Saw 2 ghosts on 2 different ships that had confirmed deaths on board, seen by several other people. Story 44. I had a humpback whale surface beside the race yacht I was delivering up the east coast of Australia. I rubbed along it, which caused $100,000 in gel coat damage. The whale blew its blowhole and I got covered in whale mucus, well, stinky water anyway. Story 45. On a platform in the Persian Gulf in the pitch-black night, I heard a motor revving hard out in the water, but couldn't see anything. It was not unusual. There were plenty of fishing boats, but they were white and could normally be seen with a flashlight. I shone my flashlight on the brightest setting and saw a large black submarine diving as it was approaching straight for us. It was surreal, and I had to give a report to Saudi Aramco the next day since it was Saudi waters. They told me it was most likely an Iranian submarine watching us. Story 46. I have only had 1 2-week stint working at sea. I was assisting a featured chef on a theme cruise. 8 days into this 2-week adventure, I woke up running down a hallway. In my dream, I was chasing someone. I can't recall who or why. I was barefoot, in pajamas with no bra, identification, or room card. I was very embarrassed going to the guest services desk to request a new room card. For context, I have been known to talk in my sleep, but I have never sleepwalked before or since. Story 47. Not my story, but my grandfather was in the United States Navy during the Vietnam War, and his ship was tasked with retrieving prisoners of war out of the water after a ship capsized. The sharks arrived first. Story 48. A drinking friend of mine has been a commercial fisherman for years. One day I asked him what was the creepiest thing he ever pulled up in his nets. His answer: a woman's hand, cut off at the wrist, with her wedding set still on her finger. Story 49. When I flew for the United States Coast Guard a couple of years ago in the Caribbean, we detected a small open boat on radar. It measured no more than 3 meters in length. We flew toward it and eventually spotted it with our optics. Zooming in, we saw 2 or more very decomposed bodies in the boat. After returning to base, we looked up the faded registration and discovered the boat was a local fishing vessel registered in Western Africa that had been missing for a few months. It was located in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. Eventually, a cutter was tasked to collect the boat and tow it back, but it was decided to scuttle it. Story 50. My dad was fishing in his small speedboat off Vancouver Island. He decided to travel out over the ocean to try his luck far from his usual area. He had been at it for a few hours when suddenly, in his peripheral vision, he spotted what he thought was an old man bobbing up behind his boat. He turned abruptly, but the man was gone. He stared around the nearby ocean surface for a minute, hoping to never see him again. when gurgling up from the depths appeared the largest gray-faced sea lion he had ever seen. Story 51. Having to rescue crew members in the engine room after a steam pipe burst during cleaning. Seeing your coworker's skin melt before your eyes as you desperately try to get them out. The screams and the smell. Story 52. I have been on many fishing boats in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There are no real scary stories, but just seeing nothing but a black abyss in every direction is pretty surreal. Story 53. A 400-meter container ship doing night rounds in the engine room gets very eerie. Ships creak and make many strange noises, and when you are alone down there in a large cathedral of machinery, you start seeing and imagining unusual things. One day, I was just finishing up and about to open a door when the wheels suddenly spun around and the door burst open, revealing a ghostly apparition in the passageway that lunged towards me. The next day, I was in front of the captain explaining why I punched the third engineer. He had been sleeping in the duty cabin and wandered down to raid the control room refrigerator, wrapped in a bed duvet. Spooky stuff. Story 54. We sailed the Suez Canal. I was working on a cruise ship. The crew was paid more to perform pirate watch. We watched the sea all night using simple night vision equipment. This was about 10 years ago. The wealthy guests might have paid 1 to 3% more for the cruise, but they expected the entire crew to risk their lives battling pirates so the guests would not have to leave their chairs. The mindset was very sick. They wanted the crew to die for them, but also wanted to witness it, or else they felt they had not received value for their money. Story 55. U.S. Navy cruiser. While inspecting a compartment called the Pittsword, as part of sounding and security, it is a compartment at the bottom of the ship that contains water to measure ship speed. It is only accessible by climbing a ladder well straight down 5 stories. A shipmate swore he had his leg grabbed by something as he was climbing out, and it scared him greatly. I thought it was just an old sailor's tale meant to scare us newcomers. However, that compartment was haunted. One night, I was in the Pittsword and bent over to look at the water level when something grabbed me so hard I almost fell into the water. I was convinced it was a shipmate hiding down there trying to play a prank, but after searching every nook and cranny in the compartment for about 10 minutes, I found nobody. I realized then that a ghost had grabbed me. I hated going down there after that. Story 56. Fascinating. I've been reading this for more than half an hour already. I can't get enough. What strikes me too is how many of you are extremely good and evocative writers. Absolutely brilliant. It makes me feel these need to be collected into several volumes of short stories. I am an editor, so I appreciate good writing even more than most. Story 57. Not me, but my husband always talks about the time he was a deckhand on a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration research boat when he was young and spry. One time, while on station in the Antarctic Circle with a cable thousands of feet in the water, their boat listed and rolled 42 degrees. Fortunately, no one went overboard or was injured. Just thinking about it makes me nervous. Story 58. Not creepy, but an old retired Navy sailor told me that during the Vietnam War there was a soldier who was caught raping a local girl who looked questionably underage. That soldier was sent overboard, and no one cared or said a thing. The way he told me the story, it was just another day. You could tell this man had seen a lot in his life. Story 59. Not me, but my uncle worked on a cargo ship. One night, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, they saw a small light moving in circles. There was no radar signal and no boat, just a light. Every time they turned, the light followed. It vanished after 3 hours. There was no explanation. 10 grown men refused to go on the night shift for a week. Story 60. Late one night, we had lights chasing us just above the water, maybe a foot off the surface, flashing ahead, then behind, then far ahead, for about an hour. Everyone was just watching, dumbfounded. Atlantic Ocean. Story 61. Never worked out at sea, but I once saw waterspouts during a bad thunderstorm when I lived near the coast. That is apocalyptic. Story 62. Patrolling the Persian Gulf. At night, you see all the oil rigs performing their burn-off. The flames eerily light up the area. It is creepy, especially when the water is calm as glass. Every so often, you see a sea snake skimming the surface. The only thought in my head is, I do not want to be here. Period. Story 63. My sister worked on a commercial fishing boat in the Bering Sea. The captain would often get drunk, and one night she heard the girlfriend screaming as if she was being attacked. My sister was armed and charged in, effectively mutinying the captain. They called the Coast Guard, who took him into custody. My sister still has post-traumatic stress disorder from the experience. With no backup and in close quarters, it was a very dangerous situation, but I am proud of her. Story 64. Watched a few seals floating on their backs, slowly eating fish that they lay on their bellies. I even saw a whale, I think, come up and swallow a seagull in one gulp. It was not warm water, so I doubt it was a shark. Story 65. A man I was sharing a cabin with did not get up for work. They eventually realized when he did not turn up for break and went looking for him that he had passed away in his bunk. Story 66. Besides the odd whale breaching, the horrible realization that there is no fifth-generation cellular network or wireless internet for the next 4 weeks while crossing an ocean is mind-boggling. After a while, you even start talking to your other crew members. Creepy stuff. Nightmare material. Story 67. Too tired to sleep, I ended up facing massive waves, icebergs dangerously close, and a mysterious 100-foot-tall light that looked right at me. Luckily, I wore my brown pants. A few years ago, my family, my wife, 2 middle school kids, and I went on a cruise. We departed from Seattle and traveled the Inside Passage. It was early June with beautiful weather and clear skies, though a bit chilly near Vancouver Island, which is normal. On the last night, as we circled back around Vancouver Island into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, we saw an incredible amount of lightning over the island. Dark, ominous clouds gathered. I checked the Marine Channel and then the Weather Channel. We were heading straight into the storm, arriving about an hour after dark. I thought I had experienced rough seas. Growing up around boats, with military parents moving us around, I spent my teen years on the east coast of the United States. I once rode out a tropical storm in the Florida Keys in a roughly 20-foot knockoff Boston whaler, mainly because my dad didn't trust weather reports. I spent a lot of time crabbing and fishing in the Chesapeake Bay, encountering seas 15 to 25 feet high. Still, this was worse than anything I'd seen. When night fell, it became pitch black. We had a balcony room because, first, I like some luxury, and second, I dreaded being stuck in an interior room during a COVID-19 lockdown. My wife sensibly went to bed early, but I stayed out on the balcony all night, staring into the darkness. For the first hour or so, floodlights illuminated the side of the ship, letting me see hundreds of feet of water around us. I saw a few small chunks of ice floating nearby and some bright blue ice about the size of a school bus. When they shut the lights off, I figured there were more ice chunks lurking nearby. Don't worry, I had plenty of chances to see large ice chunks because we were getting 5 to 10 lightning strikes per minute. It's funny because we had actually hit an iceberg earlier that week. My whole family took an excursion on a smaller boat to Dawes Glacier, and on the way back we hit the iceberg at full speed. Hard too. The crew spent about 20 minutes in the engine room afterward and looked concerned for the rest of the trip to the ship. The kids were a little worried, but I told them there was no reason to panic until the crew started handing out life jackets. I thought it was pretty cool, great 2 truths and a lie material. I was on the 10th or 11th floor of the cruise ship when I saw water hitting the balcony glass. The swells must have been over 30 feet. I found buoy data in the area showing a maximum wave height of 14 meters, which is crazy. I don't know how high the waves actually got, but I was sure the ship was going to break in two. In the middle of this, I saw a light at least as high as I was above the ocean. I was sober the whole time. The light moved vertically, sweeping its beam horizontally, came toward the ship, looked right at me, then moved away. No idea what it was, and nobody else I spoke to saw it. I would say I hallucinated it if I hadn't taken several pictures. They are truly creepy. Things I have ruled out. Lighthouse. We were 40 miles from land, and lighthouses don't engage in staring contests. The sun. It was the end of June, with sunrise after 5 a.m., while the photos were taken between 3 o'clock and 3:15 a.m. The moon. June 28, 2022 was a new moon. Aliens. I refuse to believe an alien species masters interstellar travel only to buzz a cruise ship for no reason. Things I haven't ruled out. Helicopter. My current theory is a Canadian helicopter pilot messing with people. Vivid hallucination combined with expert-level gaslighting. That would be an elaborate way to make me question my reality, which is already tenuous. Star Trek 4. The voyage home, humans from the future need whales. The 1980s were strange times. Swamp gas. How far can swamp gas travel? Inquiring minds want to know. Story 68. I have posted a few here before. I worked on research vessels for about 15 years. This is going to get lost in the middle of the comments, but that's probably for the best. This isn't some made-up story about ghosts, ghouls, mysterious lights, or sea monsters. On its own, it's not that scary, but the implications are. We were doing a project in the British Virgin Islands. It was subcontracted by the Royal Navy, so I can't tell you what it was. About 2 weeks into the 6-week project, we saw something floating on the surface of the water. At first, we thought it was a seal, shark, or dolphin. We had found one a week before caught in illegal fishing nets. One of the crew hauled it up. It wasn't marine life. It was a girl about 11 or 12 years old, naked, dead, and had been for at least a day. Almost immediately, the captain came over screaming and yelling at us to toss her back. He was terrified. This was a brave man with 30 years spent at sea. He had guided ships through storms, sailed across oceans, and even spent 2 days on a lifeboat after his fishing boat sank. He wasn't someone to be scared lightly, but this dead girl terrified him. We were a small crew, only 8 of us. There was the captain, a handful of older experienced hands, the chief researcher who was a British man in his 60s, then me, a female about my age, and a younger intern. The British man started to argue and the captain confronted him, shouting things like, "You do not want to mess with this. You do not want to touch this. We didn't see her." He wasn't angry, he was terrified. While we were arguing, one of the other crew threw the girl back into the water. A dead 11-year-old girl, and he just tossed her back overboard. At this point, the captain calmed down somewhat. He refused to tell us what was going on, but kept saying, "Trust me. We do not want to get involved with this." Afterwards, the intern, the other researcher about my age, and I were talking about it. The intern noticed something I didn't. The girl had ropes around her hands and deep cuts on her ankles caused by rope. Someone had tied her up, weighed her down, and thrown her overboard. I'm guessing the rope around her legs snapped, came loose, or wasn't tied properly. At first, I thought this was something cartel or gang-related, and the captain knew that, which is why he was so scared. But a few years later, the news about Epstein Island broke, which made me reconsider. What if Epstein Island wasn't the only one? What if there is another out there? And if there is, considering we fished a murdered girl out of the water, it's even worse. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.